Well, blessed ninth day of Christmas to you as we come to you with your daily encouragement. These days we're counting down the last days of our holiday season. Unfortunately, just by observing some things around town, I'd say that already people have assumed that Christmas is over, which is unfortunate because we're called to live into this season, live into the knowledge and presence that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. And as we will get back to our normal studying and back to the book of Revelation, we'll be getting into the idea that Jesus is the man for all nations, not just the nation he was born into, but all nations. And so on this ninth day of Christmas, we're going to turn to John 6 for a couple days here as we see how God is with us in the bread of life. And so we read from John 6 today, Jesus feeding the 5,000. Just as a note, just like Jesus' baptism, which we'll be celebrating this Sunday, Jesus feeding the 5,000 appears in all four Gospels. This is one of those important events that no Gospel wanted to leave out. And so we read today from John 6. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so that the fish as much as they wanted. So they also ate. So those who distributed them, and they were seated, and also the fish as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. They filled 12 baskets. When the disciples saw the sign that had been done, they began to say, "This indeed is a prophet who has come into the world." Now, as far as it connects to the 12 days of Christmas, it is the 12 loaves or the 12 bags of loaves of bread. And that is a sign that they are going to be distributing the apostles, the sent out ones, to many people. But let's talk about the act of faith first. First, there is a situation. A number of people need to be fed. And the disciples ask a very logical question. What are we to even start to do amongst so much need? How many of us have asked that question about the world situation today? Or any situation when we find ourselves having to help someone? And there's that famous story about the kid who's on the shore and he sees all these starfish that are starting to dry up because the shore brought them. And so he starts throwing some of them into the sea. And this man tells him, he said, "Kid, you're going to have a lot of arms to throw these into the sea. It's not going to make a difference." The kid looks at the starfish, looks at the man, And he throws another starfish into the sea, and he realizes, and he says to the man, it made a difference in that starfish's life. And that's in many ways what we are called to do. We live in an age where we like to have systemic transformations of things. I know that's what a lot of us in the mercy industry, as you'd call ministry, and other things of feeding the poor and helping those in need are called. And so they start to look at systemic plans that maybe work for larger numbers of people. But when we get into those global plans, one of the things we forget about is the individual souls that we are called to save, that we are called to make a difference in their life. No matter how broad or how big a congregation is, and I grew up in a very big congregation, it still is the one on one ministry. Or maybe let's say we belong to our denomination and we don't always like all the things that are happening, and we wonder, are we going to make a difference in a denomination? But one thing we can do is make a difference in one congregation, let alone one soul in one congregation. And that, I think, is one of the messages I get from this passage. Jesus called the people to faith. Well, how can we do any difference with such a big crowd? 6 months' wages wouldn't even cover it, one disciple says. And then Andrew, either out of faith or out of sarcasm, says, well, I got a kid with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Maybe he can do something. But of course, they give the situation to Jesus. Now it says that it was the Passover of the Jews. Now, when the Jews celebrated Passover, they were celebrating a past event. What Jesus is telling the disciples that this is no longer a past event, this is a present event. Now, there is kind of that silly little discussion about whether Jesus multiplied the miracle because he is the Word of God, or whether the people started out of compassion to share what they brought. There's an interesting arguments both ways. We don't get into the mechanics of it. But one of the things we do get is that by giving it to Jesus, by giving the situation to Jesus, we're able to multiply bread. We're able to multiply ministry. And that ministry starts from 5 loaves and 2 fish to 5,000, and then gets sent out into baskets, 12 baskets, just like the 12 days of Christmas, just like the 12 disciples or apostles. What are they among so many? Well, in the year 2024, they are the beginning of a worldwide ministry that I don't think Peter, Andrew, or Thomas, or any of the other disciples would have been able to imagine. Now, granted, they probably would have thought that Jesus would have come back already, but let's hold that suspension for now. The ministry of God, the ministry of the church of God, started from small means, with small resources. And the thing that we don't realize, whether we belong to a large suburban church or whether we belong to a small church in the country, which I have been permitted to be a pastor of these 15 years, we start from where God starts with us, saving our souls, feeding our souls and also our physical life with bread, and giving the faith and the ability to send it to the world. And my friends, that starts on this, not the first day of Christmas, but the ninth day of Christmas, a time where people in the world have already maybe forgotten about the lights, forgotten about the presents, and are getting back into their normal life, where we still are asking the question, why Jesus? Why now? What are we called to do? And how are we going to make a difference? When we tell the Lord and we tell the world, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish for 5,000. Lord, what are we going to do when Jesus says, wait and see? God bless you today. We trust that these continue to be words of encouragement. Take care. God bless. We'll see you next time.